January 26, 1945, 2:20 p.m. The frozen fields outside Holtzwihr, France. Through the smoke and chaos of battle, something impossible was happening. A single American soldier atop a burning tank destroyer was systematically destroying an entire German company's advance. The elite mountain troops of the 2nd Gebirgsdivision, veterans transferred from Norway specifically for this offensive, were being stopped cold by what appeared to be a boy who couldn't weigh more than 50 kilograms. Behind the German lines, 6 tanks, Panzer IVs and tank destroyers that had crushed resistance across Europe, sat immobilized, their commanders too shocked to advance without infantry support that was being methodically cut down by a single American. The 250 men of the reinforced German company had walked into what Wehrmacht tactical doctrine said was impossible. One soldier holding a position against an entire combined arms assault. The mathematics were stark. 40 exhausted Americans against 250 elite German mountain infantry and 6 tanks. By every principle of military science, the American position should have been overrun in minutes. Instead, for one impossible hour, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy would rewrite the rules of warfare. But to understand how a teenager from Texas came to stand alone against an army, we need to go back to the beginning. To the cotton fields where poverty forged something unbreakable in a boy who would become America's most decorated soldier. The cotton fields of Hunt County. The path to that burning tank destroyer began in the cotton fields of Hunt County, Texas, where Audie Murphy was born on June 20, 1925, to impoverished sharecroppers. The 6th of 12 children, Murphy's childhood was defined by crushing poverty and responsibility that most adults would struggle to bear. Hunt County in the 1920s and 30s was a harsh place for poor families. Sharecropping, working someone else's land for a share of the crops, kept families like the Murphys in perpetual debt. Emmett Murphy, Audie's father, struggled to provide for his growing family. The small wooden shack they called home had no electricity, no running water, and gaps in the walls wide enough to see daylight through. Young Audie learned early that life wasn't fair, and complaining about it wouldn't fill empty stomachs. He picked cotton alongside his siblings as soon as he was old enough to drag a sack. The work was backbreaking, bent over in the blazing Texas sun, fingers bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls, pulling the white fibers and stuffing them into a sack that grew heavier with each step. But it was when his father abandoned the family that Audie's childhood truly ended. He was 12 years old. One day, Emmett Murphy simply left, leaving his wife Pat to care for 12 children alone during the depths of the Great Depression. Audie took on the role of provider. He hunted for food to supplement what little the family could grow or afford. With a borrowed .22 rifle, he would disappear into the woods before dawn, tracking rabbits, squirrels, and occasionally a possum. Every shot had to count. "If I don't hit what I shoot at, my family doesn't eat tonight," young Murphy had told his neighbor Monroe Hackney, explaining his uncanny marksmanship. The boy could drop a running rabbit at 50 yards with a .22 rifle that most people couldn't hit a barn with. Each bullet cost money the family didn't have. Each miss meant empty stomachs. Under such pressure, Murphy developed a shooter's eye that would later terrify German soldiers across 3 countries. Monroe Hackney, who became something of a mentor to the boy, later recalled, "Audie had this focus about him. When he was hunting, everything else disappeared. He didn't see the trees or the sky or anything except his target, and he never missed. I've never seen anything like it before or since." This focus, this ability to shut out everything except the task at hand, would prove essential on the battlefields of Europe. A mother's death, but the worst was yet to come. In 1941, when Audie was 16, his mother Pat died of endocarditis and pneumonia. The family had no money for proper medical care. Audie watched helplessly as the woman who had held the family together through impossible circumstances grew weaker each day, until finally, she was gone. Years later, Murphy would say that watching his mother die was harder than anything he experienced in combat. At least in war, you could shoot back. Against poverty and disease, there was nothing to fight. After his mother's death, the Murphy children were scattered among relatives and orphanages. Audie managed to keep the youngest siblings together for a time, working odd jobs, picking cotton, working at a radio repair shop, anything that would bring in a few dollars. But the burden was too much for a 16-year-old boy, no matter how determined. Eventually, social services intervened and the younger children were placed in an orphanage. Audie visited them when he could, bringing whatever small treats he could afford, a piece of candy, a comic book. He promised them he would find a way to take care of them properly. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Audie Murphy saw his chance: rejection and determination. The military offered steady pay, 3 meals a day, and the ability to send money home to support his siblings in the orphanage. But even joining proved difficult for the undersized teenager. Standing just 5 feet 5 inches and weighing 110 pounds, Murphy was rejected by both the Marines and Navy as too small. The Marine recruiter took one look at the baby-faced teenager and told him to come back when he grew up. The Navy rejected him for the same reason. Murphy tried the Army paratroopers next, attracted by the extra jump pay that would mean more money to send home. But again, he was rejected. Too small, too light. They told him a strong wind might blow him into enemy territory. It was humiliating. Here was a boy who had kept his family alive through depression and poverty, who could outshoot grown men twice his size, being told he wasn't good enough to serve his country. But Audie Murphy had never accepted no as a final answer. Not when his siblings went hungry, not when bills needed paying, not now. Finally, the regular Army infantry accepted him on June 30, 1942, after his sister Corinne provided a falsified affidavit claiming he was 18. In reality, Audie was just 17, still months away from his 18th birthday. Private First Class David Mouse McClure, who went through basic training with Murphy at Camp Walters, Texas, later recalled, "We all thought he was a mascot at first, this kid who looked about 14 and weighed nothing. The drill sergeants rode him mercilessly, called him baby. But there was something about his eyes. When he was on the rifle range, those baby blue eyes went cold as winter. He never missed, not once." Basic training in the rifle range Camp Walters, located near Mineral Wells, Texas, was where the Army turned civilians into soldiers. For most recruits, basic training was a shock. The physical demands, the discipline, the constant yelling from drill instructors designed to break down individual identity and build unit cohesion. For Audie Murphy, who had been working like an adult since he was 12, the physical challenges were manageable. The 3 meals a day were more food than he'd eaten regularly in years. Having a dry place to sleep, clean clothes, and boots that fit was luxury. But the drill instructors saw this baby-faced kid and decided to make an example of him. They assigned him the heaviest packs to carry. They made him run extra laps. They called him baby, runt, kid, trying to break his spirit or make him wash out. Murphy endured it all with the same quiet determination he'd shown hunting in the Texas woods. He didn't complain. He didn't quit. He simply did what was asked, no matter how difficult. And then came the rifle range. The M1 Garand rifle was the standard American infantry weapon, a semi-automatic rifle that fired a powerful .30-06 cartridge. It was accurate, reliable, and in skilled hands, deadly. But it required proper technique, breathing control, and steady nerves to shoot well. Murphy picked up the Garand, and it was as if he'd been born holding it. The principles of marksmanship the Army taught, proper breathing, trigger squeeze, sight alignment, were things he'd figured out years ago, hunting with a .22 to keep his family fed. On qualification day, when recruits fired for score at targets ranging from 100 to 500 yards, Murphy achieved a perfect score. Then did it again, and again. The drill instructors stopped calling him baby. Sergeant Howard Price, one of Murphy's instructors at Camp Walters, wrote in his training report, "Private Murphy is the finest natural rifleman I have encountered in 15 years of military service. His shooting is not just accurate, it is instinctive. He acquires targets faster than men with years of experience. Recommend immediate advancement to marksmanship instructor." But Murphy didn't want to be an instructor. He wanted to fight. His siblings were still in that orphanage, and instructor pay wouldn't send them as much money as combat pay, with its additional hazard bonuses. More than that, though Murphy would never admit it, he wanted to prove something. This skinny kid from Texas who'd been rejected by the Marines, the Navy, and the paratroopers was going to show everyone exactly what he was capable of. He would get that chance sooner than he expected. Shipping out. In February 1943, Murphy completed basic training and was assigned to Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. The 3rd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Rock of the Marne for their stand against the Germans in World War I, was one of the Army's most storied units. Company B was scheduled to participate in the invasion of North Africa, but by the time Murphy arrived, that campaign was winding down. Instead, the company prepared for the invasion of Sicily, training in amphibious landings and mountain warfare. Murphy made few friends during this period. He was quiet, kept to himself, sent most of his pay home to his siblings. While other soldiers hit the bars and chased girls on leave, Murphy wrote letters, cleaned his rifle, and slept. Some thought he was stuck up. Others thought he was just shy. A few recognized something else, a young man carrying burdens that had nothing to do with military equipment. Private First Class Bernard Campbell, who bunked near Murphy, later recalled, "Audie didn't talk much about his family, but you could tell they weighed on him. He'd get letters from his sisters about the younger kids in the orphanage, and you could see it eating at him. I think he felt guilty, like he'd failed them somehow." Which was crazy. He was 17 years old and sending home almost his entire paycheck. But guilt doesn't care about logic. On July 10, 1943, Murphy's transformation from Texas farm boy to lethal soldier began during the invasion of Sicily. Sicily, 1st Blood Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, landed at Licata as part of Patton's 7th Army. The invasion was chaotic, landing craft hitting sandbars, men jumping into water over their heads weighed down with equipment, artillery shells exploding on the beaches. Murphy waded ashore with the first wave, water up to his chest, holding his rifle above his head. Around him, men were shouting, some were hit and went down, red spreading through the water. The beach was hell. Sand kicked up by bullets, the deafening noise of shells, the screams of wounded men. And Murphy discovered something important. He wasn't afraid. Or rather, the fear was there, but it didn't control him. It was background noise, like the sound of the artillery. He could function through it, think through it, act through it. Years of hunting, where a sudden noise might mean you lost your shot and your family went hungry, had trained him to stay calm under pressure. Now that pressure was just more intense, the company pushed inland, fighting through Italian and German resistance. The mountainous terrain of Sicily was perfect for defense, every hilltop a fortress, every valley a killing ground. The Italians mostly surrendered when pressed, but the German units fought with professional efficiency. It was in the mountains near Palermo that Murphy got his first kill. The company was pinned down by machine gun fire from a stone farmhouse about 200 yards up the slope. The German MG-42, firing 200 rounds per minute, swept the ground like a scythe. Men who tried to advance were cut down. The company commander was calling for mortar support, but the mortars were still bringing up ammunition. Murphy studied the farmhouse. He could see the muzzle flash from the machine gun, could track its traverse pattern. Between bursts, when the gunner was reloading or shifting targets, there was a window of maybe 3 seconds. Without asking permission, Murphy worked his way to the right, using a dry stream bed for cover. He moved during the machine gun bursts when the noise covered any sound he made. When the gun paused, he froze. It took him 15 minutes to move 100 yards. Then he had a clear shot at the farmhouse's flank. The German machine gun crew never saw him. Murphy fired 3 shots, 3 cracks from his M1 Garand. The machine gun went silent. Later, when the company took the farmhouse, they found 2 German soldiers dead. One had been shot through the head, the other through the neck, both from ranges exceeding 200 yards. Captain Paul Harris, Murphy's company commander, came to find him after the fight. "Was that you who took out the machine gun?" "Yes, sir." "Good shooting, Murphy." "Thank you, sir." That was it. No drama, no celebration. Murphy had seen a problem, eliminated it, and moved on. But Harris made a note in his report. Private Murphy displays a natural aptitude for combat that is extraordinary in one so young and inexperienced. The transformation begins. Over the next weeks, as the 3rd Infantry Division fought across Sicily, Murphy's reputation grew. He volunteered for patrol duty, the most dangerous assignment in infantry warfare. While other soldiers tried to avoid patrols, Murphy sought them out. Part of it was the extra combat pay, which meant more money for his siblings. But part of it was something else, something Murphy himself might not have fully understood. In combat, everything was clear. There was an objective: take that hill, hold that bridge, scout that village. There was a method: use terrain, coordinate fire, move tactically. And there was a result: success or failure, survival or death. It was cleaner than the messy complications of civilian life. Murphy, who had watched his mother die of poverty and disease, who had failed to keep his family together despite his best efforts, found in combat something he could control. If he was skilled enough, careful enough, quick enough, he could survive. His fate was in his own hands. And he discovered something else. He was very, very good at it. Sergeant William Paulson, who led Murphy's squad in Sicily, later described Murphy's combat methodology. Murph didn't fight angry. That's what was terrifying about him. He fought cold, calculated, like he was doing arithmetic. See a German, eliminate the German, move to the next German. No emotion, no hesitation, just deadly efficiency. This coldness, this ability to kill without emotion, would later haunt Murphy. But in the summer of 1943, fighting across Sicily, it kept him and his comrades alive. At Palermo, when a German counterattack threatened to overrun American positions, Murphy single-handedly held a critical road junction. Using grenades in his rifle, he killed or wounded 15 German soldiers in less than 30 minutes. Captain Harris recommended him for the Bronze Star, writing, "This soldier's actions were instrumental in maintaining our defensive line and preventing what could have been a disastrous penetration of our positions." Murphy was 19 years old and had been in combat for 6 weeks. The invasion of mainland Italy, beginning with the landings at Salerno in September 1943, would prove even more brutal than Sicily. Salerno and the Italian meat grinder. The Salerno landings on September 9, 1943, were nearly a disaster. German forces, anticipating the invasion, had prepared strong defensive positions. When American forces came ashore, they walked into a buzzsaw. Company B landed under heavy fire. Men were hit before they got off the landing craft. The beaches were swept by machine gun fire and artillery. The company lost 30% of its strength in the first hour. Murphy, landing with the second wave, found himself in a nightmare of smoke, explosions, and screaming wounded men. He helped drag injured soldiers to cover, then moved forward with his squad to secure the beachhead. The fighting around Salerno was some of the most intense of the Italian campaign. The Germans, fighting from prepared positions in mountainous terrain, made the Americans pay for every yard of ground. Villages became fortresses. Every stone wall concealed a machine gun. Every hilltop had artillery observers calling down fire. And the weather turned. Cold rain fell constantly, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud. Men developed trench foot from constantly wet boots. Supplies were irregular. Hot food was rare. The division fought in conditions that tested endurance as much as courage. Through it all, Murphy endured. While others broke under the strain, and many did, evacuated with combat fatigue, Murphy kept functioning. His childhood in Texas poverty had prepared him for hardship in ways the other soldiers, many from comfortable middle-class homes, couldn't match. Being cold, hungry, and scared? That was just Tuesday for a kid who'd grown up in a sharecropper's shack. The Volturno River. In October 1943, the 3rd Infantry Division reached the Volturno River, a major German defensive line. The river, swollen by fall rains, was 150 feet wide and moving fast. The Germans held the far bank in strength, with machine guns positioned to sweep the water. Crossing the Volturno would be a nightmare. Men exposed in boats or wading through waist-deep water while Germans shot at them from prepared positions. But it had to be done. The division couldn't advance without crossing the river. Company B drew one of the assault positions. On the night of October 13th, they would cross under cover of darkness, establish a bridgehead, and hold it until reinforcements could cross at dawn. The crossing was chaos. German flares lit up the night, turning darkness into day. Machine gun fire swept the water. Mortar shells exploded, sending up geysers. Men slipped on the muddy bottom and went under, dragged down by their equipment. Some drowned, others were hit, and the current carried them away. Murphy made it across with his squad, 9 men clawing their way up the muddy far bank into a hail of bullets. They found a shell crater and collapsed into it, gasping for breath. That's when the German counterattack hit. Out of the darkness came German infantry, supported by machine gun fire from concealed positions. Murphy's squad was exposed, caught in the open with no cover except the shallow crater. The squad leader, Sergeant Jenkins, was hit in the first burst of fire. He went down hard, blood spreading across his chest. The corporal panicked and started to run. Murphy grabbed him. "Where the hell are you going?" "We gotta fall back." "Fall back where? Into the river? We hold here." Murphy took command. He positioned the remaining 7 men around the crater, fields of fire overlapping. He had 1 man with a Browning automatic rifle, 2 riflemen on each flank, and he took the center with his M1 Garand. The Germans came in waves. Murphy's squad met them with disciplined fire. The bar gunner swept the approach. The riflemen picked targets, and Murphy, firing methodically, dropped German soldiers with precision that seemed impossible in the darkness. When a German squad tried to flank their position, Murphy grabbed grenades and crawled 30 yards through the mud to get within throwing range. He eliminated the flanking squad, then crawled back to his position. The fight lasted 2 hours. When dawn finally came and reinforcements crossed the river, they found Murphy's squad still holding their crater. Around them lay 15 dead German soldiers. The squad had taken 3 wounded, including Sergeant Jenkins, who would survive, but they hadn't given an inch. Captain Harris, crossing with the reinforcements, stared at the scene in disbelief. "Murphy, what happened here?" "They tried to push us back into the river, sir. We disagreed." For this action, Murphy received the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. He was promoted to corporal. He was 19 years old and had been in combat for 4 months. Anzio, the Wildcat. If Salerno was hell, Anzio was something worse. Winston Churchill called it the Wildcat. American soldiers had less charitable names for it. The Anzio landings in January 1944 were supposed to outflank German defensive lines and open the road to Rome. Instead, Allied forces found themselves trapped on a beachhead, surrounded by German forces holding the high ground. For 4 months, the Anzio beachhead became a killing ground. German artillery positioned in the hills overlooking the flat beachhead could hit anywhere with devastating accuracy. Soldiers lived in constant fear. You could be eating breakfast and a shell would land on your foxhole. You could be sleeping and wake up dead. The constant shelling, the inability to move without drawing fire, the knowledge that you were trapped with nowhere to retreat, it broke men's minds. Combat fatigue evacuations reached record levels. Men who had fought bravely through Sicily and southern Italy simply couldn't take the unrelenting stress of Anzio. But Murphy, now a sergeant leading a squad, somehow endured. He developed a fatalistic attitude that many combat veterans adopt. The shell with your name on it would find you no matter what you did, so there was no point worrying about it. "Either you're gonna die or you're not," he told a replacement who was paralyzed with fear during a shelling. "Worrying about it won't change anything. Just keep your head down and do your job." At Anzio, Murphy earned his first Silver Star for an action that became legendary in the 15th Infantry. A German tank, supported by infantry, had penetrated American lines and was systematically destroying foxholes. The tank was a Panzer IV, armored against rifle fire, its 75mm gun capable of obliterating anything it hit. Men were abandoning positions, falling back in disorder. Murphy grabbed a bazooka, a tube-launched anti-tank rocket. He'd never fired one in combat before. The weapon was notoriously inaccurate and required getting dangerously close to your target, within 100 yards for a reliable hit. While the tank was focused on shelling foxholes to its front, Murphy worked his way around to its flank. He crawled through a drainage ditch, moving slowly to avoid detection, the bazooka awkward on his back. At 50 yards, Murphy set up, loaded a rocket, aimed, and fired. The rocket hit the tank's side armor and exploded. The tank didn't explode. Panzer IVs were tough, but it was disabled, its track blown off. The crew bailed out and ran. The German infantry, seeing their tank support gone, withdrew. Murphy's squad, inspired by his action, counterattacked and restored the line. Sergeant Murphy displayed exceptional courage and initiative, Captain Harris wrote in his citation. His actions undoubtedly saved numerous American lives and prevented a potentially catastrophic breach in our defenses. By the time Allied forces finally broke out of Anzio in May 1944, Murphy had been wounded twice by shrapnel, had killed dozens of German soldiers, and had earned a reputation as one of the most effective squad leaders in the division. He was also beginning to change in ways that worried his friends. The cost of killing. Private First Class Anthony Abramsky, who joined Murphy's squad as a replacement at Anzio, later recalled, "When I first met Sergeant Murphy, I thought there'd been a mistake. He looked like a kid, maybe 17, with this soft voice and polite manner. Called everyone sir, even privates sometimes, but then we went on patrol and I saw the other Murphy. On patrol, his whole face changed. Those blue eyes went empty, cold. He moved like a ghost. I swear you couldn't hear him walking even through brush. And when we made contact with Germans, there was no hesitation. He killed with the same expression you'd use to swat a fly. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen, because I realized this kid had killed so many people that it meant nothing to him anymore. This was the curse Murphy was beginning to live with. The same emotional detachment that made him an exceptional soldier was separating him from his humanity. Every farm boy wants to be a soldier. Then he finds out killing another man isn't hard. It's easy, too easy, and that realization changes you forever. Murphy started having nightmares. He'd wake up in his foxhole, drenched in sweat, reliving firefights. He'd see the faces of men he'd killed, young German soldiers, some probably younger than him, just doing their duty like he was doing his. But he couldn't stop, couldn't quit. His siblings needed his combat pay, his men needed his leadership, and somewhere deep inside, Murphy needed the clarity of combat, the one place where his skills mattered and his actions had clear results. Rome and southern France. The liberation of Rome in June 1944 was brief glory before the campaign continued. Murphy, now a platoon sergeant, led his men through the jubilant crowds, accepting flowers and kisses from grateful Italians, then back into combat as the division pursued retreating German forces north. In August 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division participated in Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. After the grinding brutality of Italy, France seemed almost pleasant. The weather was better, the terrain less defensive, and French civilians welcomed the Americans as liberators. But the Germans still fought hard, and men still died. During the drive through southern France, Murphy's reputation continued to grow. Near Montélimar, when his platoon leader was killed in an ambush, Sergeant Murphy took command. With 18 men against a German company of over 100, he organized a defense of a critical crossroads. For 2 hours, Murphy's makeshift platoon held that crossroads against repeated German assaults, using every trick he'd learned in 2 years of combat, interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery concentrations, aggressive use of grenades. Murphy turned 18 men into an immovable object. When reinforcements finally arrived, the crossroads was littered with German dead. Murphy's platoon had taken casualties, 3 dead, 7 wounded, but they'd held. Estimates suggested Murphy personally had accounted for at least 15 enemy killed. His leadership earned him a battlefield commission to 2nd lieutenant on October 14, 1944. At 19 years old, Audie Murphy was now an officer in the United States Army. The boy who'd been rejected by the Marines and Navy as too small, who'd barely qualified for regular infantry, was now leading men in combat. But his greatest test was still ahead. The Colmar Pocket. By January 1945, the Allied advance across France had stalled. While most of France had been liberated, one significant German stronghold remained, the Colmar Pocket, an 850-square-mile bridgehead west of the Rhine River in Alsace. The Colmar Pocket represented everything horrible about winter warfare. The terrain was a mixture of frozen fields, dense forests, and small fortified villages. The weather was brutal, temperatures hovering around freezing, snow several feet deep in places, constant wind that cut through even the heaviest overcoats. But it was the strategic importance that made the Colmar Pocket so deadly. Hitler had personally ordered it held at all costs. As long as German forces controlled this territory, they maintained a foothold on the west bank of the Rhine, a potential launching point for counteroffensives and a psychological victory in the face of Allied advances. To hold the pocket, the Germans had reinforced it with some of their best remaining units. 2nd Gebirgsdivision, elite mountain troops who had been fighting in Norway, were specially transferred to the Colmar Pocket. These weren't the exhausted, demoralized units the Allies had been facing elsewhere. These were professional soldiers, well-trained, well-equipped, and determined to hold their ground. For the 3rd Infantry Division, and specifically for Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, the Colmar Pocket would become a frozen L. Company B's deterioration. By the time Company B approached the village of Holtzwihr in late January 1945, they were a ghost of their former strength. A full-strength infantry company in World War II consisted of 187 men, 6 officers, and 181 enlisted men, organized into a headquarters section and 3 rifle platoons. Company B numbered just 40 effectives. In 5 days of fighting, leading up to January 26th, they had lost 102 men wounded, and all officers except Lieutenant Murphy killed or evacuated. Men who had survived Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Rome were finally reaching their breaking point. Staff Sergeant Walter Hendrickson, who had been with Company B since Sicily, later described their condition. "We were finished, completely, used up. Most of us hadn't slept more than an hour or two in the last 3 days. We were living on cold K rations when we could eat at all, because hot food couldn't get forward through the German artillery. Half the guys had frostbite. Our machine guns were freezing up. We had to piss on them to thaw the mechanisms, which worked for about 10 minutes before they froze again." The physical exhaustion was compounded by something worse: the psychological toll of watching friends die day after day in a war that seemed like it would never end. Germany was clearly losing. Everyone knew it. But the Germans kept fighting, and Americans kept dying, and for the men of Company B, the question was simply whether they would survive long enough to see victory. Lieutenant Audie Murphy, at 19 years old, was the last officer standing. He was fighting with a leg wound from shrapnel received 2 days earlier, though he had told no one about it. His leg throbbed constantly, and he walked with a slight limp he tried to hide. But reporting it would mean evacuation, and evacuation would mean leaving his men without any officer leadership. So he ignored the pain, changed the bandage himself when he could find a private moment, and kept leading. The night before. The night of January 25-26, 1945, was brutally cold. Company B held positions along the edge of the WW2 forest, looking out across nearly a mile of open ground toward the German-held village of Holtzwihr. Murphy had positioned his depleted company as best he could. The woodline provided some cover and concealment, but it was far from ideal. The ground in front sloped gently down toward the German positions, meaning any advancing enemy would be moving uphill, a small tactical advantage, but one Murphy would take. 2 M10 tank destroyers had been attached to Company B for anti-tank support. The M10 was an American tank destroyer, essentially a tank chassis with an open-topped turret mounting a powerful 3-inch gun. They were designed to kill enemy tanks, but their open tops made them vulnerable to artillery and infantry attack. Murphy positioned the 2 M10s where they could cover the open ground with their main guns and machine guns. The crews were exhausted, like everyone else, but they were professionals. They knew their job. The infantry was spread dangerously thin along the woodline. With only 40 men to cover a defensive position that should have required 180, there were gaps in the line, places where German infantry could potentially infiltrate without being seen. Murphy walked the line that night, checking positions, talking quietly with his men. He had a gift for leadership that went beyond his tactical skill. Despite his youth, the men trusted him. He'd proven himself too many times for them to doubt him now. "How you doing, Abramski?" Murphy asked, finding Private First Class Anthony Abramski in a shallow foxhole. "Cold, Lieutenant. Can't feel my feet." "Take your boots off. Rub your feet, then put dry socks on if you've got them." "I'll be fine, sir." "That's an order, Private. Frostbite won't wait for a convenient time. If your feet go, you're useless to me and your squad." "Yes, sir." Murphy moved on, checking each position, making small adjustments, offering quiet encouragement. He established his command post in a drainage ditch that provided some protection and a good view of the approaching ground. Field telephone lines connected him to the supporting artillery batteries, several miles to the rear, but capable of delivering devastating firepower if called upon correctly. Those artillery batteries were Murphy's only real hope of stopping a determined German attack. With 40 men and 2 tank destroyers against whatever the Germans might send, artillery support would make the difference between survival and annihilation. As Murphy settled into his command post that night, he reviewed his situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 2 years of combat. The mathematics were simple and brutal. His company was understrength, exhausted, and low on ammunition. The terrain favored defense, but only if he had enough men to hold it. The tank destroyers gave him some anti-tank capability, but if they were knocked out, he'd have no way to stop German armor. On the other hand, the Germans probably didn't know how weak Company B was. If Murphy could make enough noise, create the illusion of a stronger force, maybe the Germans would be cautious. Maybe they'd probe instead of attacking in force. It was a thin hope, but Murphy had survived on thin hopes before. Around 0200 hours, Murphy finally allowed himself to try to sleep, wrapped in a thin blanket in the frozen drainage ditch. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by artillery fire, both German and American, that rumbled across the night like distant thunder. He dreamed of Texas, of hunting in the woods before dawn, of a time when killing meant food for his family rather than survival in a war that ground men into meat. He woke at 0530 hours before dawn to the sound of German artillery beginning to range in on Company B's positions. Dawn of January 26th. January 26, 1945, dawned gray and bitter cold. The temperature hovered around freezing, with wind that cut through the heaviest overcoats like they were paper. Snow lay 3 feet deep in places, though constant artillery fire had churned much of the battlefield into a moonscape of frozen mud and ice. Murphy ate a cold K ration for breakfast, crackers, cheese, and a chocolate bar that was nearly frozen solid. He heated water for coffee using a small can of Sterno, cupping his hands around the tin cup to draw warmth from it. Around him, Company B stirred to life. Men emerged from foxholes and shallow dugouts, stamping their feet to restore circulation, breathing into cupped hands. The morning ritual of soldiers everywhere, checking weapons, redistributing ammunition, taking care of bodily functions, before the day's fighting began. The German artillery had stopped for now, but everyone knew it would start again. Artillery was the biggest killer in World War II, responsible for more casualties than all other weapons combined. A properly executed artillery barrage could devastate infantry positions, killing men who never saw their killer, destroying in minutes what had taken hours to build. Murphy checked in with his squad leaders, confirming that everyone was as ready as they could be. Ammunition was distributed as evenly as possible, though stocks were low. Each man had maybe 60 rounds for his rifle and a few grenades. The machine gun crews had a few hundred rounds per gun, enough for a sustained firefight, but not enough for a prolonged battle. The M10 tank destroyer crews checked their vehicles, making sure the engines would start in the cold, that the guns would traverse, that ammunition was readily accessible. Both crews knew that if German tanks showed up, they would be priority targets. Tank destroyers didn't have the heavy armor of true tanks. Their survival depended on killing enemy armor before the enemy armor killed them. At 0900 hours, Murphy received word over the field telephone that German activity had been spotted around Holtzwihr. Observers reported what looked like troops massing, possibly preparing for an attack. Murphy relayed this information to his men, telling them to stay alert. But in truth, staying alert was almost impossible after days of constant combat and no sleep. Men dozed at their posts despite the cold, exhaustion overriding their survival instincts. At 1100 hours, more reports came in. Significant German movement in Holtzwihr, possible tank movement. Murphy requested artillery fire on the village to disrupt whatever the Germans were planning, but was told that ammunition was limited and artillery support was prioritized for confirmed attacks, not suspected ones. So Company B waited. The hours crawled by with the terrible slowness of men waiting for battle. Some soldiers talked quietly. Others wrote letters they might not live to mail. Some prayed. Others just stared at the gray sky and thought about home. Murphy spent the time reviewing his defensive plan, looking for weaknesses, thinking through possible scenarios. If the Germans attacked with infantry only, Company B could probably hold. If they brought tanks, it would depend on whether the M10s could knock them out quickly. If they brought both in a coordinated assault. Murphy pushed that thought away. No point worrying about what you couldn't control. At 1300 hours, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the German artillery barrage began. The barrage. The first shells came without warning, screaming out of the gray sky to explode among Company B's positions. Tree bursts were the worst, shells that exploded in the treetops, showering deadly fragments downward where foxholes offered no protection. The noise was indescribable. Each explosion was a physical blow, pressure waves slamming into your body, sound so loud it went beyond hearing into pure sensation. The ground shook. Trees splintered, snow and frozen earth erupted in geysers. Men pressed themselves into whatever cover they could find, curled into the smallest possible targets, hands over their heads as if that would protect them from high explosive shells. Some prayed, some screamed, though their voices were lost in the overwhelming roar. Some simply endured, shock and exhaustion reducing them to passive acceptance of whatever came. Murphy, in his drainage ditch command post, watched the barrage with professional detachment. This was preparation fire, softening up defenses before the main attack. The Germans were doing everything by the book. 30 minutes of artillery to kill defenders, destroy weapons, and break morale. Then infantry and armor would advance against whatever remained. Except Company B had been on the receiving end of German artillery for weeks. They knew how to survive it. You spread out so no single shell could kill multiple men. You got as deep into the ground as possible. You made yourself small and accepted that survival was mostly luck. The barrage lasted 30 minutes, though to the men enduring it, it seemed like hours. Shells fell with mechanical regularity, walking back and forth across Company B's positions, the German artillery observers adjusting fire to ensure complete coverage. When the barrage finally lifted at 1330 hours, Murphy immediately checked in with his squad leaders via field telephone. Casualties were surprisingly light. 2 men killed, 5 wounded seriously enough to need evacuation. The wounds of exhaustion and frostbite couldn't be evacuated. There were simply too many. But the barrage had achieved its psychological purpose. Company B was shaken, nerves raw, some men on the edge of breaking. Murphy's voice over the field telephone was calm, almost casual. "All right, they've had their turn. Now it's ours. Stay alert. They'll be coming soon." At 1400 hours, the German attack materialized. The assault begins. Private First Class Donald Ekman was the first to spot them. He was in a foxhole on the left flank of Company B's line, scanning the open ground through binoculars despite shaking hands. "Oh my God," he said to his foxhole mate. "Oh Jesus Christ, here they come." "How many?" "All of them." Through the gray afternoon light, the German assault formation emerged. 6 tanks, Panzer IVs and tank destroyers, their long 75mm guns capable of destroying anything the Americans had. The tanks advanced in a line, hatches buttoned up, moving slowly across the frozen ground. Behind the tanks came infantry, lots of infantry, men in white snow camouflage, almost invisible against the snow-covered fields, moving in disciplined tactical formations. These weren't the half-trained conscripts the Allies had been facing lately. These were professionals, the elite mountain troops of the 2nd Gebergs Division. Ekman grabbed the field telephone. "Lieutenant Murphy, tanks and infantry. At least 6 tanks and, couple hundred infantry." Murphy was already watching through his binoculars. He made quick calculations. 6 tanks, probably 250 infantry based on the formations he could see. A reinforced German company with full armored support, against his 40 exhausted men and 2 tank destroyers. The mathematics were impossible. By every principle of military science, Company B should withdraw immediately. There was no shame in falling back against overwhelming odds. The company would be destroyed if it tried to hold. But withdrawing would mean giving up the wood line, which would expose the entire American flank to German attack. Other units, other Americans, would die because Company B had fallen back. Murphy made his decision in seconds. "All positions, hold your fire until they're within 400 yards. Tank destroyers, engage enemy armor as soon as you have clear shots. Artillery, stand by for fire mission." He picked up the field telephone connected to the artillery batteries. "Fire mission, enemy infantry and armor approaching our position. Coordinates." He read off the map coordinates, marking where the German formations were advancing. "Shot out," came the reply from the artillery. Seconds later, shells whistled overhead to explode among the advancing Germans. The artillery barrage was accurate, creating black geysers of earth and snow among the white camouflaged infantry. But the Germans kept coming. They'd been through artillery before. They knew you had to accept casualties and keep advancing, or the artillery would pin you down forever. At 600 yards, the M10 tank destroyers opened fire. The crack of their 3-inch guns was shockingly loud, even after the artillery barrage. The first shots missed. The crews were exhausted and cold-numbed, their hands shaking from fatigue and adrenaline. Return fire from the German tanks was immediate and devastatingly accurate. These weren't new crews learning their trade. These were veterans who knew exactly what they were doing. An 88mm shell, the Germans had equipped some of their tanks with the fearsome 88mm gun that could penetrate any Allied armor, struck the rear M10 squarely in the turret. The explosion was enormous. The tank destroyer's ammunition cooked off, secondary explosions tearing the vehicle apart. The crew had seconds to react. The commander and gunner threw themselves out of the burning turret. The loader wasn't fast enough. His screams were mercifully brief before the flames consumed him. The 3 surviving crew members ran for the woods, their uniforms smoking, faces black with soot. One collapsed halfway there, his legs giving out from shock. 2 of his comrades from Company B's infantry ran out under fire to drag him to safety. The forward M10, attempting to maneuver for a better firing position, slid sideways into a drainage ditch. The frozen ground provided no traction for its tracks. The driver tried to reverse, then forward, rocking the vehicle, but it was stuck fast. The crew, realizing they were helpless targets, abandoned the tank destroyer and retreated to the woods. They'd survived the destruction of one M10 and had no intention of dying in the second. Just like that, Company B had lost its only anti-tank capability. The German tanks, seeing both M10s disabled, advanced more confidently. At 400 yards, Company B's infantry opened fire. Rifles cracked, machine guns chattered, but small arms fire bounced off the tank's armor like rain. The German infantry, using the tanks as cover, continued their advance. They moved professionally, using fire and maneuver tactics, half the force advancing while the other half provided covering fire, then leapfrogging forward. At approximately 1420 hours, with both tank destroyers out of action and German infantry closing to within 200 yards, Audie Murphy made the decision that would define his legend: the impossible stand. Murphy ordered his remaining men to fall back to prepared secondary positions deeper in the woods. It was the right tactical decision. The company couldn't hold the wood line against tanks and 250 infantry. Better to withdraw to positions where the terrain would channel the German advance, where they might have a chance. But Murphy himself didn't retreat. Private First Class Anthony Abramsky watched in disbelief as Lieutenant Murphy, instead of falling back with the company, ran forward through the artillery fire toward the burning M10 tank destroyer. "What the hell is he doing?" Abramsky said to no one in particular. The M10 was fully engulfed in flames at the rear, where the 88mm shell had ignited its fuel and ammunition. Black smoke poured from the hull, rising in a thick column that could be seen for miles. The heat was intense enough to be felt from 30 feet away, creating waves in the cold air. At any moment, the remaining ammunition could explode, turning the vehicle into a massive bomb. Tank destroyers carried dozens of high-explosive shells and hundreds of machine gun rounds. When they exploded, they scattered shrapnel for hundreds of yards. Murphy climbed onto the burning tank destroyer as if he were climbing onto a tractor back in Texas. He moved with deliberate calm, ignoring the flames, ignoring the bullets that were now pinging off the hull as German infantry spotted him. On top of the M10 was a 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun, mounted for anti-aircraft defense but equally effective against ground targets. The gun was still functional, its ammunition still intact in the vehicle's storage. Murphy swung the machine gun around to face the advancing German formations. From this elevated position, maybe 8 feet off the ground, he had a clear field of fire across the approaching enemy. He could see everything: the tanks, the infantry formations, the officers directing the assault. But he was also completely exposed. A single figure silhouetted against the gray sky with no cover except the smoke from the burning vehicle beneath him. Any German soldier with a clear shot could kill him. Any tank gunner could end him with one shell. Private First Class Anthony Abramsky, watching from the woodline, later testified, "I saw Lieutenant Murphy climb on top of the burning tank destroyer while bursts of machine gun fire were heard. Pistol fire from the advancing infantry battered against the hull and tread. It was the greatest display of guts and courage I've ever seen." Murphy checked the 50 caliber. The gun was cold to the touch despite the flames below, the metal conducting heat away, or maybe Murphy's hands were too numb from cold and adrenaline to feel anything. He charged the weapon, cycling around into the chamber. The mechanism worked smoothly. The Germans were at 150 yards now, close enough that Murphy could see individual faces. Young men, probably some of them teenagers like him, doing their duty for their country just as he was doing his. Murphy pushed those thoughts away. This was arithmetic now, simple mathematics, targets and solutions. He pressed the butterfly trigger of the 50 caliber and began to fire. The M2 Browning. The M2 Browning heavy machine gun was one of the most effective weapons ever designed. Developed by John Browning in 1918, it fired 150 caliber bullets, half an inch in diameter, weighing about 1.5 ounces each, at a rate of 550 rounds per minute. The bullets traveled at 2,900 feet per second, carrying kinetic energy capable of penetrating light armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Against human targets, the .50 caliber was devastating. A hit anywhere on the body was likely fatal. The massive bullets tore through flesh and bone, creating catastrophic wounds. In skilled hands, the M2 was a precision instrument. Unlike lighter machine guns that were primarily suppressive weapons, spraying fire to keep enemy heads down, the .50 caliber could be used for accurate fire at individual targets. The gun's weight, 84 pounds, provided stability. Its slow rate of fire, slow relative to other machine guns, allowed for controlled bursts, and Audie Murphy's hands were the most skilled hands imaginable. Years of hunting, where every bullet had to count, had taught Murphy to track moving targets instinctively. 2 years of combat had refined that skill against human targets. He didn't aim in the traditional sense, looking down sights, calculating windage and elevation. He simply knew where the bullets would go, the same way a professional baseball player knows where to throw without thinking about the mechanics. Murphy's first burst caught a German squad advancing on his left flank. 3 men went down, the others scattered looking for cover in the open field. There was none. Murphy traversed the gun smoothly and fired again. 2 more Germans fell. The German advance hesitated, confusion rippling through their ranks. They'd been advancing against a position they thought was nearly defeated. Now, suddenly, men were dying from fire so accurate it seemed impossible. German officers shouted orders, trying to maintain momentum. The tanks continued forward, their commanders probably assuming that whoever was on that burning tank destroyer would be killed momentarily by tank fire or would flee when the ammunition exploded. They were wrong on both counts. Hour of fire. For the next hour, Audie Murphy conducted a defensive action that military historians would later call the most thoroughly documented single-handed stand in World War II. Murphy fired the .50 caliber in short, controlled bursts, 6 to 8 rounds per burst, just enough to ensure hits without wasting ammunition. He tracked targets with mechanical precision, identify threat, engage threat, verify elimination, move to next threat. German infantry trying to advance on the left flank found themselves under devastating fire. White camouflaged figures fell in the snow, their camouflage now working against them as blood spread bright red against white. A German squad tried to flank right, using the terrain for concealment. Murphy spotted the movement and shifted his fire. The squad leader went down first, then the machine gunner carrying the MG-42. The rest of the squad went to ground, pinned. The German tanks, massive Panzer IVs that had crushed resistance across Europe, sat immobilized. Their commanders faced an impossible tactical problem. Their infantry support was being systematically destroyed by fire from that burning tank destroyer. Without infantry to protect them from close-range anti-tank weapons, tanks were vulnerable. But they couldn't leave their infantry unsupported either. And the standing orders were clear. Take that wood line, break through the American position. So the tanks sat, their guns traversing slowly, trying to get a clear shot at Murphy through the smoke and chaos. But Murphy, partially obscured by the black smoke from the burning M10, made a difficult target. And the tank's 75mm guns, designed for long-range accuracy, were less effective at close range against a small, moving target. One tank commander tried to solve the problem with machine gun fire. The tank's hull-mounted MG-34 opened up, bullets cracking past Murphy's position. Murphy dropped prone on the tank destroyer's hull, waited for the burst to end, then rose and returned fire with the .50 caliber. The heavy bullets struck the tank's turret, not penetrating the armor but creating a deafening racket inside. The German tank commander, buttoned up inside his steel box with .50 caliber rounds hammering against it, decided discretion was the better part of valor and pulled back slightly. Throughout this, Murphy maintained contact with the artillery batteries via field telephone. The phone line, miraculously, had survived the artillery barrage and hadn't been cut by German fire. Murphy, standing atop a burning vehicle, firing a machine gun with one hand, held the telephone handset with the other, and called in corrections for artillery fire. Drop 100, right 50, Murphy would say calmly between bursts of machine gun fire, adjusting the artillery to hit German formations he could see advancing. The artillery fire was danger close. Shells were landing within 100 yards of Murphy's position, close enough that fragments whistled past him. At one point, the artillery battery commander protested that Murphy was calling fire too close to his own position. Murphy's response was matter of fact. "Just keep firing. If you stop, we're all dead anyway." The German infantry made multiple attempts to close with Murphy's position. Each time, Murphy's accurate fire forced them back. Bodies were piling up in the snow. Estimates would later suggest Murphy was killing or wounding one German soldier every minute. Staff Sergeant Walter Hendrickson, watching from the woodline, later described the scene. "It was like watching a man play target practice at a carnival, except the targets were shooting back." Lieutenant Murphy stood on that burning tank destroyer, completely exposed, and systematically shot down every German who showed himself. "I saw him change ammunition belts twice, and both times he did it like he was on a training range. No rush, no panic, just methodical efficiency." But Murphy wasn't invulnerable. Bullets were hitting all around him. One round struck the machine gun's mount, sending fragments of metal into Murphy's leg, adding a new wound to the shrapnel injury he was already carrying. Another bullet tore through his uniform jacket, so close he felt the heat of its passage, and the M10 beneath him was still burning. The heat was becoming unbearable. Murphy's face was reddened from exposure to the flames. His uniform was smoking in places. The rubber soles of his boots were starting to melt from the hot metal. The psychological pressure was even worse than the physical danger. Murphy knew that at any second, the tank destroyer's remaining ammunition could explode. He would have perhaps a tenth of a second of awareness before he was torn apart. There would be no warning, no chance to jump clear. Every second he stood there was a second of staring death in the face. Most men would have fled. Basic survival instinct, the primal urge to escape danger, would have driven them off that burning vehicle. But Murphy stayed. His men were depending on him. The artillery fire he was directing was the only thing keeping the Germans from overrunning Company B's positions. If he left, the company would be destroyed. So he stayed, and he fought, and he killed. The German perspective. After the war, German military records captured by Allied forces revealed the confusion and shock among the 2nd Gebirgsdivision's officers during the assault on Holtzwihr. One German company commander, whose name was redacted from the captured documents, wrote in his after-action report, "The assault should have succeeded within 30 minutes. We had overwhelming superiority in numbers and armor, but we were stopped by what appeared to be a single American on a burning vehicle. Our casualties were catastrophic. Men refused to advance. Even experienced squad leaders were killed the moment they showed themselves. It was the most effective defensive fire I encountered in 6 years of warfare." Another report from a German tank commander noted, "We could not advance without infantry support, but the infantry could not advance because of the accurate machine gun fire from the American position. The American soldier appeared to be either supremely courageous or insane, standing exposed on a burning vehicle that could explode at any moment. We attempted to target him with main gunfire, but the smoke and his small profile made accuracy difficult. By the time we maneuvered for clear shots, he had killed enough of our infantry that the attack lost momentum." What frustrated the German commanders most was that they knew they were facing minimal opposition. Captured American soldiers, interrogated after previous engagements, had told them that Company B was under strength and exhausted. The Germans knew they should be able to overwhelm the position, but they couldn't get past that one American on the burning tank. The tide turns around, 1500 hours, 3:00 p.m. Approximately 40 minutes into Murphy's stand, the German assault began to falter. The elite mountain troops of the 2nd Gebirgsdivision were experienced soldiers, but they were also human. They'd watched dozens of their comrades cut down by precise machine gun fire. They'd seen officers and squad leaders killed the moment they tried to lead advances. They'd been under constant artillery fire, called in with devastating accuracy by someone who could see the entire battlefield. And they'd made no progress, none. Despite overwhelming numerical and armored superiority, they hadn't gained a single yard of ground. Morale, that intangible factor that determines whether soldiers will continue pressing an attack or seek cover, began to crack. German squads that had been advancing aggressively now huddled in whatever cover they could find, shallow depressions in the ground, behind the tanks, in shell craters. Some began pulling back without orders, crawling through the snow toward their start positions. The German tank commanders, seeing their infantry support evaporating, faced a critical decision. They could continue forward without infantry, risking close-range anti-tank fire from hidden American positions in the woods. Or they could withdraw and regroup. Professional training and tactical doctrine won out. Tanks without infantry support were vulnerable. The attack had failed to achieve its objectives. Better to withdraw and try again with a better plan. One by one, the German tanks began reversing, their commanders probably cursing the American who had single-handedly stopped their assault. Murphy, seeing the German infantry falling back and the tanks withdrawing, shifted his fire to make their retreat as costly as possible. Running men made easy targets. Murphy's .50 caliber reached out across the snow-covered field, and more white camouflaged figures fell. By 15-20 hours, 3:20 p.m., the German assault had completely collapsed. The elite mountain troops were in full retreat, leaving their dead and many of their wounded on the field. The tanks had withdrawn to hold-down positions near Holtzwihr, unwilling to advance without infantry support. Murphy had held. Against impossible odds, he had held. Aftermath and evacuation. When the German fire finally slackened enough for Murphy to dismount from the M10, he discovered his legs barely worked. He'd been standing for over an hour on a burning vehicle in freezing temperatures while firing a heavy machine gun. His muscles had locked up, partly from tension, partly from the cold, partly from the wounds he'd taken. He half climbed, half fell off the tank destroyer, landing hard in the snow. For a moment he just lay there, the adrenaline that had sustained him draining away, leaving behind exhaustion so profound he could barely move. Private First Class, Anthony Abramsky and several other soldiers ran out from the woodline, expecting to find Murphy dead or seriously wounded. Instead, they found him trying to stand up, using the still-burning M10 for support. "Lieutenant, are you hit?" Abramsky asked, seeing blood on Murphy's leg. "Just scratches. Check the men. See who needs evacuation." "Sir, you need to be evacuated." "I said check the men." Murphy limped back to the woodline where Company B was reorganizing. The casualties from the German assault were surprisingly light, 3 more killed, 7 wounded. Murphy's stand had prevented the Germans from closing to effective range where their superior numbers would have overwhelmed Company B's positions. Staff Sergeant Walter Hendrickson approached Murphy with a look of awe. "Sir, I counted at least 50 Germans down out there, maybe more." Murphy didn't respond. He was staring at the field, at the bodies in the snow, at the blood that stained the white ground red. 50 men, 50 human beings with families, with hopes, with lives that had just ended. 50 mothers who had received telegrams, 50 fathers who would never see their sons again. Murphy had killed them all, efficiently, methodically, with no more emotion than he'd shown hunting rabbits in Texas to feed his siblings. And he felt nothing. That was the worst part. He felt nothing. "Sir," Hendrickson said, concerned by Murphy's silence, "get the wounded evacuated. Reset the defensive line. They might come again." But the Germans didn't come again that day. The assault on Holtzwihr had been broken. The elite 2nd Gebirgsdivision, which had expected to roll over the depleted American company, had been stopped cold by what appeared to be a single soldier's impossible stand. As evening fell and the temperature dropped even further, medics finally convinced Murphy to let them look at his wounds. The shrapnel in his leg from 2 days prior had gotten worse, infected from being neglected. The new wounds from metal fragments during his stand on the M10 needed cleaning and bandaging. Murphy, knowing that serious wounds meant evacuation and evacuation meant leaving his men, had minimized everything. "Just scratches," he kept saying, even as the medic cleaned wounds that made him grit his teeth against the pain. The medic looked at Murphy with a mixture of respect and frustration. "Sir, you need to go to the aid station. Some of these wounds need proper treatment." "Patch them up. I'm staying with the company." "Lieutenant, I said patch them up." The medic did his best with limited supplies, then moved on to treat other wounded. Murphy wrapped himself in a blanket, accepted a cup of hot coffee that someone had miraculously produced, and sat in his drainage ditch command post as darkness fell. Around him, Company B prepared for another night. Men cleaned weapons, redistributed ammunition, tried to warm themselves however they could. Some talked quietly about what they'd witnessed. Lieutenant Murphy's stand on the burning tank destroyer would become the stuff of legend. Others were simply grateful to be alive. recognition, and the Medal of Honor. In the days following January 26, 1945, as Company B continued operations in the Colmar Pocket, word of Murphy's stand began to spread through the 3rd Infantry Division. Staff Sergeant Walter Hendrickson had filed a detailed report of the action, describing how Lieutenant Murphy had single-handedly held off an entire German company. Private First Class Anthony Abramsky and several other witnesses provided sworn statements. The testimonies were remarkably consistent, all describing the same impossible scene of one man standing atop a burning tank destroyer, methodically destroying a German assault. Captain Paul Harris, who had known Murphy since Sicily and had watched his transformation from undersized private to decorated officer, began the paperwork for the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor was America's highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Since its creation during the Civil War, fewer than 3,500 had been awarded. The standards were extraordinarily high. But Harris knew that if any action qualified, Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr did. The citation process was thorough and lengthy. Multiple witnesses were interviewed. German records were examined to confirm the enemy's strength and composition. Artillery battery logs were reviewed to verify Murphy's fire direction. Even the burned-out M10 tank destroyer was photographed and its position documented. What emerged was perhaps the most thoroughly documented single-handed defensive action in World War II. Every aspect of Murphy's stand could be verified through multiple independent sources. The citation Captain Harris drafted read in part, Second Lieutenant Audie L. Murphy commanded Company B, which was attacked by 6 tanks and waves of infantry. Lieutenant Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to a prepared position in the woods while he remained forward at his command post and continued to give fire directions to the artillery by telephone. Behind him, to his right, one of our tank destroyers received a direct hit and began to burn. Its crew withdrew to the woods. Lieutenant Murphy continued to direct artillery fire, which killed large numbers of the advancing enemy infantry. With the enemy tanks abreast of his position, Lieutenant Murphy climbed on the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its .50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. He was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides, but his deadly fire killed dozens of Germans and caused their infantry attack to waver. The enemy tanks, losing infantry support, began to fall back. For an hour, the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position and wiped out a squad that was trying to creep up unnoticed on his right flank. Germans reached as close as 10 yards, only to be mowed down by his fire. He received a leg wound but ignored it and continued his single-handed fight until his ammunition was exhausted. He then made his way back to his company, refused medical attention, and organized the company in a counterattack, which forced the Germans to withdraw. His directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction and enabled it to hold the woods which had been the enemy's objective. But the Medal of Honor process would take months. In the meantime, Murphy continued to fight. The final months of war. The Colmar Pocket was finally eliminated by early February 1945. The 3rd Infantry Division, including the remnants of Company B, pushed the Germans back across the Rhine River. The last piece of French soil was liberated. But the war wasn't over. Germany itself remained, and Hitler had ordered a fight to the last man. The spring of 1945 would see some of the fiercest fighting of the European war as Allied forces drove into Germany. Murphy, now recuperating from his wounds at a field hospital, fought to return to Company B. The doctors wanted to evacuate him to a rear area hospital for proper treatment of his infected leg wound. Murphy refused, signing himself out against medical advice as soon as he could walk without limping too badly. He rejoined Company B in late February 1945 as the division prepared to cross the Rhine and drive into Germany. The company had received replacements, fresh-faced soldiers who'd never seen combat, who looked at the battle-hardened veterans with a mixture of awe and fear. Murphy, at 20 years old, was one of the oldest in terms of combat experience. He'd been fighting for nearly 2 years, had survived Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Rome, southern France, and the Colmar Pocket. Most of his original companions from 1943 were dead or evacuated with serious wounds. The new replacements looked at Murphy and saw a legend. The stories of his stand at Holtzwihr had spread throughout the division. Men whispered that he'd single-handedly killed over 50 Germans while standing on a burning tank. Some thought the stories were exaggerated. They weren't. Private James Hendricks, who joined Company B as a replacement in March 1945, later recalled his first meeting with Murphy. "I expected this huge, intimidating guy, like a movie hero. Instead, I met this short, soft-spoken kid who looked like he should still be in high school. But when you looked in his eyes, you saw something that made you shiver. Those eyes had seen too much. They were old eyes in a young face." The crossing of the Rhine in late March 1945 was anticlimactic compared to previous operations. German resistance was crumbling. Units that had fought ferociously months earlier were now surrendering en masse. The once mighty Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Murphy led his platoon through the final campaigns in Germany with the same methodical efficiency he'd shown throughout the war. He took no unnecessary risks. The end was in sight, and getting killed in the last weeks of the war would be a particularly bitter irony. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Audie Murphy had survived. Against all odds, the skinny kid from Texas who'd been rejected by the Marines and Navy, who'd fought through some of the bloodiest campaigns of the war, had survived. But survival came with a cost that wouldn't be fully apparent for years. America's most decorated soldier. By war's end, Audie Murphy had accumulated an astonishing array of military decorations. He received every combat award for valor that the U.S. Army could bestow, including the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, Legion of Merit, and 3 Purple Hearts. He also received decorations from France and Belgium, including France's highest military honor, the Legion of Honor, and the Croix de Guerre with Palm. Belgium awarded him the Belgian Croix de Guerre. In total, Murphy received 33 awards and decorations, making him the most decorated American soldier of World War II. But the numbers didn't capture the full story. Murphy had killed at least 240 enemy soldiers, confirmed kills, not estimates. He'd been wounded 3 times. He'd served 27 months in combat zones. He'd participated in campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. And he'd done it all before his 21st birthday. On June 2, 1945, Major General John E. Dahlquist, commander of the 36th Infantry Division, Murphy had been transferred to the 36th late in the war, presented Murphy with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony in France. Murphy stood at attention while Dahlquist read the citation, then placed the medal around Murphy's neck. Photographers captured the moment, the young officer, baby-faced despite everything he'd been through, receiving the nation's highest honor. The photographs would be published in newspapers across America, making Murphy instantly famous. But Murphy himself seemed disconnected from the ceremony. He later said he kept thinking about all the men who deserved medals but would never receive them because they were dead. The survivors received recognition. The dead received telegrams to their families. It didn't seem fair. Returning home, Murphy returned to the United States in June 1945, sailing into New York Harbor aboard a troop ship crowded with soldiers eager to resume their civilian lives. The war in Europe was over, though fighting continued in the Pacific. Murphy, with enough points from his combat service and decorations, was eligible for discharge. New York gave the returning heroes a parade. Murphy, uncomfortable with the attention, marched with other Medal of Honor recipients while crowds cheered and ticker tape fell from buildings. It was surreal after the frozen fields of Europe, the constant danger, the dead friends. He returned to Texas, to the small towns where he'd grown up in poverty. His siblings, the ones he'd joined the army to support, were thriving. The money he'd sent home had kept them fed, clothed, and housed. They'd survived the orphanage and were making their way in the world. Murphy tried to settle into civilian life. He bought a small house for his siblings. He attended ceremonies where local officials honored him. He gave brief speeches about patriotism and duty, saying what people expected to hear. But at night, he couldn't sleep. When he did sleep, he had nightmares. He'd wake up screaming, reaching for weapons that weren't there. his heart pounding as he relived firefights that had happened months or years ago. This was before anyone understood post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1945, they called it shell shock or battle fatigue, and the general attitude was that tough men just dealt with it. Real soldiers didn't complain about bad dreams, so Murphy didn't complain. He tried to push through it, to be the hero everyone expected him to be. But the war had left scars deeper than the shrapnel wounds in his leg. Hollywood calls. In the summer of 1945, actor James Cagney saw Murphy's photograph on the cover of Life magazine. The photo showed Murphy in uniform, wearing his Medal of Honor, looking impossibly young to have accomplished what he'd accomplished. Cagney, one of Hollywood's biggest stars, was struck by Murphy's appearance. Here was an authentic American hero who also happened to be photogenic. Cagney invited Murphy to Hollywood, suggesting he might have a future in pictures. Murphy, who had no other career prospects, he'd left school in the 5th grade to help support his family and had no skills beyond farming and soldiering, decided to give Hollywood a try. In September 1945, he moved to Los Angeles. The transition was difficult. Murphy had no acting experience. His Texas accent was thick. He was painfully shy around people he didn't know. And Hollywood in 1945 was full of established actors returning from military service who actually knew what they were doing. Murphy struggled for more than a year, living in a cheap apartment, taking acting classes, going to auditions where casting directors told him he was too short, too baby-faced, not commanding enough. The irony wasn't lost on Murphy. He'd killed more enemy soldiers than anyone in the U.S. Army, but he wasn't commanding enough to play a soldier in a movie. His first role was a small part in the 1948 film Beyond Glory, where he played himself in a brief scene. It was awkward and stiff, but it got him noticed. More small roles followed. Murphy studied acting with fierce determination, applying the same focus he'd brought to marksmanship in combat. Gradually, he improved. His natural charisma, the quality that had made men follow him in combat, translated to screen presence. Directors learned that Murphy's best performances came when he played quiet, intense characters, not the loud, blustering heroes common in 1940s war films. In 1949, Murphy landed his first starring role in Bad Boy, playing a troubled youth sent to reform school. The film wasn't a major success, but it established Murphy as a viable leading man. More roles followed, mostly in westerns and war films. Then, in 1955, came To Hell and Back. To Hell and Back. To Hell and Back was based on Murphy's 1949 autobiography of the same name. The book, written with ghostwriter David McClure, had been a bestseller, telling Murphy's story from impoverished Texas childhood through his war experiences to his return home. Universal Studios bought the film rights and offered Murphy the lead role, playing himself. Murphy was hesitant. He didn't want to seem like he was glorifying his wartime actions. He was also concerned about reliving traumatic experiences for the cameras. But Universal convinced him, and filming began in 1954. The production was elaborate, with large battle sequences and period-accurate equipment. Murphy threw himself into the role, insisting on authenticity wherever possible. The filming of the Holtzwihr sequence, recreating Murphy's stand on the burning tank destroyer, was particularly difficult. Murphy had nightmares for weeks during and after filming those scenes. Standing on a mock-up of an M10, even with cameras rolling and stunt coordinators ensuring safety, brought back memories Murphy had tried to suppress. But the film, released in 1955, was a massive success. It became Universal's highest-grossing film until Jaws 20 years later. Audiences were moved by the story of the poor farm boy who became America's greatest war hero. Critics praised Murphy's understated performance, noting that he brought authenticity that a trained actor couldn't match. To Hell and Back made Murphy wealthy and cemented his status as both a war hero and a Hollywood star. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, he appeared in numerous films, mostly westerns and war movies. He was never considered a great actor in the classical sense, but he had a presence, a quiet intensity that worked well on screen. By the mid-1960s, Murphy had appeared in over 40 films. He was financially secure, famous, and respected. By any external measure, he had successfully transitioned from war hero to civilian success story. But internally, Murphy was struggling with demons that Hollywood success couldn't exorcise. The long shadow of war. Throughout his Hollywood career and beyond, Murphy battled what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He had violent nightmares, often waking up his wife. He married actress Wanda Hendricks in 1949, though they divorced in 1951. He later married Pamela Archer in 1951, a marriage that lasted until his death, with his screaming and thrashing. He couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol under his pillow. He often slept with the lights on, because darkness brought back memories of night combat. Sudden loud noises would send him diving for cover, his body reacting before his mind could process that he was safe. Murphy developed insomnia, going days with little or no sleep. He turned to sleeping pills, taking increasingly large doses to force himself to rest. The pills worked, but they left him groggy and disconnected during the day. He also developed depression, experiencing long periods where nothing seemed to matter, where the effort of getting out of bed seemed insurmountable. He'd sit for hours, staring at nothing, reliving firefights, seeing the faces of men he'd killed. His wife Pamela later described finding Murphy sitting in their living room at 3 a.m., fully dressed, holding a pistol, staring at the door as if expecting German soldiers to come through it. When she asked what he was doing, he'd blink, look confused, and say he wasn't sure. The worst part was the guilt. Murphy felt guilty for surviving when so many of his friends hadn't. He felt guilty for killing so many enemy soldiers, even though he knew he'd done what was necessary. He felt guilty for the nightmares, for the times his PTSD affected his family, for not being the hero everyone thought he was. In the 1950s and early 1960s, there was little understanding of PTSD. Mental health treatment for veterans was limited and stigmatized. Real men didn't admit to psychological problems. Heroes especially weren't supposed to have mental health issues. So Murphy suffered largely in silence, self-medicating with sleeping pills and occasionally alcohol, trying to maintain the public image of the successful war hero while privately fighting a battle against his own mind. Breaking the silence. What made Audie Murphy truly heroic wasn't just his actions at Holtzwihr or his other combat achievements. It was his decision in 1968 to publicly discuss his PTSD and advocate for better treatment of veterans' mental health issues. In 1968, America was deep into the Vietnam War. Soldiers were coming home with the same psychological trauma that had affected Murphy and his generation, but now there was even less public support. Vietnam veterans were often treated with suspicion or hostility rather than honor. Murphy, seeing young veterans struggling with the same demons he'd fought for 20 years, decided to speak out. In interviews with newspapers and magazines, he discussed his nightmares, his insomnia, his addiction to sleeping pills. He talked about the difficulty of transitioning from combat to civilian life, the disconnect between how people saw him and how he saw himself. "People see the medals and think that makes you a hero," Murphy said in a 1969 interview. "But the medals don't help you sleep at night. They don't stop the nightmares. They don't bring back your friends who died. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who did his job and happened to survive, and now I'm trying to live with what that job required me to do." This public discussion was revolutionary for its time. Here was America's most decorated war hero admitting to mental health struggles, breaking the stigma that said real soldiers didn't have psychological problems. Murphy went further, advocating before Congress for better mental health treatment for veterans. He pushed for research into what we now call PTSD, arguing that the government had a responsibility to care for soldiers psychologically as well as physically. "We train soldiers to kill efficiently and effectively," Murphy testified before a congressional committee in 1969. "We spend months teaching them to overcome their natural reluctance to take human life, then we send them home and expect them to just turn off everything we taught them, to forget what they've seen and done, to be normal civilians again. It doesn't work that way. We owe these men better." Murphy's advocacy helped lay the groundwork for the modern understanding of PTSD and veterans' mental health treatment. While he didn't live to see the full implementation of programs he advocated for, his willingness to speak publicly about his struggles gave other veterans permission to seek help. Business ventures and struggles. Alongside his Hollywood career and advocacy work, Murphy invested in various business ventures with mixed success. He bred and raced horses, opened a chain of Western-themed restaurants, and invested in real estate. Some ventures were successful. Others failed spectacularly, costing Murphy significant amounts of money. By the late 1960s, despite his film earnings, Murphy was facing financial difficulties. He'd been generous with money, helping fellow veterans, supporting his siblings, investing in businesses that lost money. He also had a gambling problem, betting large sums on horse races and cards. The gambling was another way of chasing the adrenaline rush of combat, trying to recapture the intensity of life-and-death situations through high-stakes betting. By 1970, Murphy was deeply in debt. The film offers had slowed down. He was 45 years old, and Hollywood favored younger actors. His last film appearance was in 1969. He was living largely on residuals from his earlier films and attempting to salvage his business investments. Friends from his Army days, many of whom had gone on to successful civilian careers, offered to help. Murphy refused most offers, his Texas pride preventing him from accepting what he saw as charity. He'd taken care of himself since he was 12 years old, and he wasn't going to start depending on others now. But privately, Murphy was worried about his future. He had a wife and 2 sons to support. His PTSD wasn't improving with age. If anything, it was getting worse, and the financial pressure was constant. In May 1971, Murphy was scheduled to appear at a ceremony in Virginia honoring Medal of Honor recipients. He'd then planned to fly to North Carolina to finalize a business deal he hoped would solve his financial problems. He never made it. Memorial Day weekend, 1971. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander 680 in Atlanta, Georgia. He was flying to Martinsville, Virginia for the Memorial Day ceremony, then on to Roanoke for business meetings. The weather was terrible. Heavy rain, low clouds, poor visibility. The pilot, a 42-year-old businessman with significant flying experience, filed an instrument flight plan, confident he could handle the conditions. The plane crashed into Brush Mountain near Catawba, Virginia at approximately 3:00 p.m. All 6 people aboard, including Murphy, were killed instantly. The impact was devastating, the plane disintegrating on contact with the heavily forested mountainside. Due to the remote location and poor weather, it took 2 days to locate the crash site. Search and rescue teams had to hike miles through difficult terrain to reach the wreckage. What they found confirmed that no one could have survived. Audie Murphy, who had survived Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, the Colmar Pocket, and dozens of firefights against the best soldiers Germany could field, who had stood alone against 250 enemy troops and 6 tanks, had died in a plane crash just days before his 46th birthday. A nation mourns. The news of Murphy's death shocked America. Obituaries appeared in every major newspaper, recounting his extraordinary war record and his subsequent Hollywood career. Television news programs ran segments showing clips from his films and photographs from his military service. President Richard Nixon issued a statement. Audie Murphy was one of the great heroes of World War II. His courage and his dedication to duty have been an inspiration to millions. His death is a loss to the entire nation. Veterans organizations across the country held memorial services. In Texas, flags flew at half-staff. In Hollywood, where Murphy had worked for over 20 years, studios and theaters dimmed their lights in tribute. But the most fitting tribute came from the soldiers who had served with Murphy. Hundreds of veterans, many of whom hadn't seen each other since the war, traveled to Murphy's funeral at Arlington National Cemetery on June 7, 1971. The funeral was held with full military honors. Murphy's flag-draped coffin was carried by an honor guard to a gravesite on a hillside overlooking the city of Washington. A bugler played taps. A rifle salute echoed across the cemetery. The flag was folded and presented to Murphy's widow, Pamela. Among the mourners were men from Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, survivors who had fought alongside Murphy from Sicily to Germany. They stood at attention, tears running down weathered faces, remembering the skinny kid from Texas who had saved their lives more times than they could count. Private First Class Anthony Abramsky, who had watched Murphy stand at Holtzwihr 26 years earlier, later said, "We knew Audie would get himself killed someday. We just thought it would be in combat doing something heroic. A plane crash seemed like a waste, but then again, Audie had already done more in 45 years than most people do in twice that time." Murphy was buried in Section 46 of Arlington National Cemetery. His grave would become one of the most visited sites in the cemetery, second only to President Kennedy's. To this day, visitors leave flowers, American flags, and notes thanking him for his service. The investigation. The investigation into the plane crash concluded that the probable cause was the pilot's decision to continue visual flight in instrument meteorological conditions, essentially, flying by sight in weather that required instruments. The pilot had apparently become disoriented in the heavy clouds and rain, unable to see the mountain ahead until it was too late. Murphy's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the plane's owner and the estate of the pilot, but the legal proceedings brought no satisfaction. No amount of money would bring Murphy back, and the question of why an experienced pilot had made such a fatal error remained unanswered. Some of Murphy's friends speculated that Murphy might have been fatalistic about his survival. He'd expressed in various interviews a sense that he'd been living on borrowed time since the war. Perhaps there was a part of him that didn't fight very hard when the weather turned dangerous, that accepted whatever came. But such speculation was ultimately meaningless. Audie Murphy was gone, and with him went the last living link to one of the most extraordinary combat actions in American military history. Legacy and remembrance. In the decades since Murphy's death, his legacy has only grown. To Hell and Back remains a classic war film, introducing new generations to his story. His autobiography continues to sell, offering readers an unvarnished look at both poverty and Depression-era America and the realities of World War II combat. But Murphy's most important legacy may be his advocacy for veterans' mental health. His willingness to publicly discuss his PTSD helped break down stigmas that had prevented countless veterans from seeking help. The modern understanding of PTSD and the VA's mental health programs for veterans owe a debt to Murphy's courage in speaking out. In 1996, the Department of Veterans Affairs dedicated the Audie L. Murphy Memorial Veterans Hospital in San Antonio, Texas. The hospital specializes in treating combat-related PTSD, an honor Murphy would have appreciated more than any military decoration. Numerous schools, streets, and public buildings across America bear Murphy's name. Fort Hood, Texas, now Fort Cavazos, has the Audie Murphy Club, an elite organization for Army non-commissioned officers who demonstrate the highest standards of performance and leadership. The town of Farmersville, Texas, near where Murphy was born, maintains a museum dedicated to his memory. The small building houses his medals, film memorabilia, and artifacts from his military service. Visitors from around the world make pilgrimages to see where America's greatest war hero came from. Holtzwihr remembers. In Holtzwihr, France, the village that Murphy helped liberate, his memory is honored with a memorial. A stone monument marks the location where Murphy made his stand, and nearby, the woods where Company B held their positions have been preserved. Every year on January 26th, the anniversary of the battle, French and American veterans gather at the memorial for a ceremony. The mayor of Holtzwihr gives a speech, reminding attendees of the sacrifice American soldiers made to liberate France. An American representative, usually from the U.S. Embassy in Paris, lays a wreath. Local French citizens, some of whom were children when Murphy fought there in 1945, attend the ceremonies. They speak of the liberation, of the terror of living under German occupation, of the joy when American forces arrived. "We owe everything to men like Lieutenant Murphy," one elderly French woman said at the 2015 ceremony, marking the 70th anniversary of the battle. "He could have retreated to safety, but he stayed and fought so that we could be free." The people of Holtzwihr will never forget. The burned-out hulk of the M10 tank destroyer Murphy used has long since been removed, melted down for scrap decades ago. But visitors to the memorial can see photographs of the vehicle, can stand where Murphy stood, can look across the field where 250 German soldiers advanced and one American stopped them. It's difficult, standing on that quiet French hillside on a peaceful day, to imagine the chaos and terror of January 26, 1945. The trees have grown back. The shell. Craters have been filled in. The blood has long since washed away, but the memory remains. Understanding the man behind the medal. To truly understand Audie Murphy's achievement at Holtzwihr and his life more broadly, it's necessary to look beyond the simple narrative of war hero. Murphy was a complex, often contradictory figure, a man of extraordinary courage who battled crippling anxiety, a deadly warrior who was gentle and soft-spoken in civilian life, a national symbol of heroism who privately doubted his own worth. Murphy's childhood poverty was crucial in shaping who he became. Growing up hungry, watching his mother die because the family couldn't afford medical care, taking responsibility for his siblings when he was barely more than a child himself, these experiences forged an iron core of determination. When Murphy stood on that burning tank destroyer at Holtzwihr, he wasn't thinking about glory or medals. He was thinking about his men, his duty, and getting the job done. That was what he'd always done, taking care of those depending on him, no matter the personal cost. His marksmanship, developed by necessity, gave him a skill that translated directly to combat effectiveness. But it was his psychological makeup, his ability to remain calm under extreme stress, to shut out fear and focus entirely on the task at hand, that made him truly exceptional. This wasn't fearlessness. Murphy felt fear like any soldier. But he'd learned as a child to function despite fear, to do what needed doing even when circumstances were desperate. The same qualities that made Murphy an extraordinary soldier, however, made civilian life difficult. The emotional detachment that allowed him to kill efficiently prevented him from forming easy connections with people. The hypervigilance that kept him alive in combat made peacetime feel dangerous and unpredictable. The intensity that drove him to perfection in military matters found few healthy outlets in civilian life. Murphy's post-war struggles with PTSD were not a sign of weakness, but evidence of his humanity. Despite killing hundreds of enemy soldiers, Murphy never became callous about death. Each kill haunted him. The faces of men he'd shot appeared in his nightmares. This psychological burden, the cost of being very good at killing, was something Murphy carried for the rest of his life. The tactical brilliance military historians studying the Holtzwihr action have noted Murphy's tactical brilliance, often overlooked in favor of focusing on his raw courage. His stand wasn't just brave, it was tactically sound, using all available assets to maximum effect. By positioning himself on the burning M10, Murphy gained elevation that allowed him to see and engage targets across the entire battlefield. This was crucial. From ground level, the gently rolling terrain would have limited his visibility in fields of fire. The height advantage, even just 8 feet, made all the difference. His use of artillery was masterful. Murphy didn't just call for random fire. He observed where German forces were concentrating, where their officers were directing troops, where their advance was strongest. Then he called precise fire on those locations, using artillery as a force multiplier. The German records captured after the war show that artillery fire was responsible for as many casualties as Murphy's machine gun, perhaps more. Murphy's fire discipline with the .50 caliber was also noteworthy. He fired in short, controlled bursts rather than hosing down the battlefield with continuous fire. This conserved ammunition, prevented the barrel from overheating, and most importantly, was more accurate. Each burst had a purpose, engaging a specific target or group of targets. His psychological warfare, intentional or not, was devastatingly effective. The sight of one American standing exposed on a burning vehicle, calmly shooting Germans while artillery rained down, had a profound impact on German morale. Soldiers expecting an easy victory instead encountered what seemed like a supernatural opponent. This psychological shock was as important as the physical casualties in breaking the German assault. What if Murphy had retreated? It's worth considering what would have happened if Murphy had followed his own order and retreated with his men into the woods. Military doctrine would have supported such a decision. A junior officer's duty is to preserve his men's lives, not sacrifice himself in a probably futile gesture. If Murphy had retreated, the German assault would likely have succeeded. Company B's secondary positions were weaker than their primary line, and without Murphy's fire direction for artillery, the Germans would have had freedom of movement. The 250 German infantry, supported by 6 tanks, would probably have overrun Company B's remaining 40 men within an hour. This would have created a breach in the American line, exposing adjacent units to flanking attacks. The 3rd Infantry Division's entire position might have been compromised, potentially requiring a withdrawal and giving up hard-won ground. The strategic implications were significant. The Colmar Pocket was Germany's last toehold west of the Rhine. If German forces had achieved a breakthrough at Holtzwihr, it might have prolonged the campaign by weeks, costing hundreds or thousands of additional American casualties. On a smaller, more human scale, most of Company B would probably have been killed or captured if Murphy had retreated. The men who survived, Anthony Abramsky, Walter Hendrickson, Donald Ekman, and dozens of others, owed their lives to Murphy's decision to stay and fight. So while Murphy's action was extraordinary, it was also necessary. Sometimes military necessity demands extraordinary actions, and Murphy understood this instinctively. The 240 enemy killed. Murphy's official tally of 240 enemy soldiers killed during the war is conservative. The actual number may have been higher, but the military only counted confirmed kills, bodies that could be verified, or kills witnessed by multiple sources. To put this number in perspective, the average American infantryman in World War II fired thousands of rounds and might never kill a single enemy soldier. Most combat deaths were caused by artillery and machine guns firing on area targets, not aimed rifle fire at individuals. Murphy's high kill count resulted from several factors. First, his exceptional marksmanship meant he rarely missed. Second, he actively sought combat through volunteering for patrols and leading attacks. Third, he survived long enough to accumulate these kills. Most soldiers were killed or seriously wounded within their first few months of combat, but the number also represented a psychological burden. Murphy knew he'd killed 240 men, fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Each had been a human being with dreams and fears, forced by circumstances to fight in a war they probably didn't want. Murphy understood this, and it haunted him. In interviews, Murphy was reluctant to discuss his kill count, changing the subject when asked. He never bragged about it, never expressed pride in it. To him, it was simply the grim arithmetic of war, kill or be killed, and he'd been better at killing than most. Murphy's influence on military culture. Audie. Murphy's story has influenced American military culture in ways that extend far beyond his individual service. He represents the ideal of the citizen soldier, the ordinary American who rises to extraordinary circumstances through courage and skill. Murphy's story is taught in military leadership courses as an example of leading from the front, of never asking subordinates to do something you wouldn't do yourself. The fact that he was a commissioned officer who'd risen from the enlisted ranks gave him credibility with the men he led. They knew he understood their experiences and concerns. His tactical decisions at Holtzwihr are studied in military academies as examples of maximizing limited resources, using terrain and supporting assets effectively, and making bold decisions under pressure. The action demonstrates principles still taught to officers today. Maintain visibility of the battlefield, concentrate fire on enemy weaknesses, use all available weapons in coordinated fashion. Perhaps most importantly, Murphy's post-war advocacy for veterans' mental health changed how the military addresses psychological casualties. While the military was slow to implement comprehensive PTSD treatment, it took decades. Murphy's public discussion of his struggles helped establish that psychological wounds were as real and worthy of treatment as physical injuries. The measure of a hero. What makes someone a hero? Is it courage in battle? Military decorations, fame and recognition? Audie Murphy was all of these things, but perhaps his real heroism lay elsewhere, in his honesty about his struggles, his advocacy for others suffering similar difficulties, his willingness to challenge the narrative that war heroes are invulnerable supermen. Murphy understood that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite fear. He was terrified on that burning tank destroyer at Holtzwihr. Any rational person would have been. But he acted anyway because it was necessary, because his men depended on him, because duty demanded it. He was equally courageous after the war, admitting to vulnerabilities that the public didn't want to acknowledge in their heroes. It would have been easier to maintain the facade, to pretend the war hadn't damaged him, to be the untroubled hero everyone expected. Instead, he told the truth, knowing it would disappoint some people, hoping it would help others. That may have been his bravest act, not the hour on the burning tank, as extraordinary as that was, but the decades of living with the consequences, of fighting his inner demons, of trying to help others avoid his struggles, all while carrying the weight of being America's most decorated soldier. 80 years later, as we approach the 80th anniversary of Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr, his story remains remarkably relevant. America is still asking young men and women to fight wars in distant lands. Veterans are still coming home with physical and psychological wounds. The debate continues about how we care for those who've served. Murphy's story speaks to these ongoing issues. It reminds us that heroism comes in many forms, not all of them comfortable or convenient. It demonstrates that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. It shows that the costs of war extend far beyond the battlefield, affecting veterans and their families for decades. The young veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan face many of the same challenges Murphy did: difficulty adjusting to civilian life, PTSD, depression, the feeling that civilians can't understand what they've experienced. Murphy's willingness to discuss these issues, to admit that the great war hero had nightmares and fears, has given these younger veterans a model for seeking help without shame. Educational programs now teach Murphy's story to school children, using it to discuss not just World War II history, but broader themes of courage, duty, sacrifice, and the human costs of war. The story resonates because it's not just about military action, but about a human being facing impossible circumstances and finding the strength to endure. Final reflections. On January 26, 1945, on a frozen field in France, 19-year-old Audie Murphy performed an action that defied all military logic and probability. For one impossible hour, he held off an entire German company, killed or wounded over 50 enemy soldiers, and saved his men from destruction. But that hour was just one moment in a life of quiet heroism. The same determination that kept Murphy on that burning tank had kept his family fed during the Depression. The same courage that made him stand and fight made him publicly discuss his PTSD decades later. The same sense of duty that sent him into combat again and again made him advocate for veterans who couldn't advocate for themselves. Murphy's physical courage at Holtzwihr earned him the Medal of Honor. His moral courage in confronting his post-war struggles and helping others do the same deserves equal recognition. He showed that heroes are not invulnerable supermen, but ordinary people who find the strength to do extraordinary things, both on battlefields and in the quieter struggles of daily life. The skinny kid from Texas who was rejected by the Marines and Navy, who hunted rabbits to feed his siblings, who stood alone against an army, who became a Hollywood star, and who fought his final battle against the invisible wounds of war. This was Audie Murphy. His story, 80 years later, still has the power to inspire, to educate, and to remind us of the costs and the meaning of service. The field at Holtzwihr is quiet now, the sounds of battle long faded. But the memory of what happened there on that frozen January day endures, a testament to human courage and the extraordinary capacity for heroism that exists in ordinary people when circumstances demand it. As long as nations ask their young to go to war, as long as soldiers face impossible odds, as long as veterans struggle with the aftermath of combat, Audie Murphy's story will remain relevant. Not as a tale of glory, Murphy would have rejected that, but as an honest accounting of what war demands of those who fight it, what it costs them, and why we must honor that sacrifice by caring for those who survive. The boy from Texas who became America's greatest war hero now rests on a hillside in Arlington National Cemetery, his grave visited by thousands each year who come to remember and to honor. His story lives on, told and retold, a reminder of what one person can accomplish when courage, skill, and duty converge at a moment of desperate need. And somewhere in France, in a small village called Holtzwihr, the wind blows across fields where once a battle raged, where once a young American stood alone against impossible odds and proved that sometimes, just sometimes, one person can make all the difference.